Welcome to Newsday, reporting live from Singapore. I'm Karishma Vaswani. The headlines. The Taliban celebrate with gunfire and fireworks as the last U.S. military flight leaves Kabul, and America confirms its 20-year war in Afghanistan is over.
18 days ago, the United States and our allies began our evacuation and relocation operation in Kabul. A few hours ago, that operation was completed.
The U.S. departure, the final hours of the American presence, are marked by controversy over a drone strike. The U.S. say the targets were IS fighters. Eyewitnesses say children were among the dead.
We lost 10 persons, including of my daughter. He was at 2 years old. She was 2 years old.
Oh my God! Go,
the aftermath of Hurricane Ida. The waters are rising in the southern U.S. as the power was knocked out in New Orleans and people survey the damage. And China clamps down on children's game time over concerns they're becoming addicted.
Live from our studio in Singapore. This is BBC News. It's Newsday.
Welcome to BBC News, broadcasting to viewers in the UK and around the world. The US military has completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan after a mission lasting nearly 20 years. General Frank McKenzie, who has overseen the pullout, said the US had evacuated nearly 80,000 civilians from Kabul in the past few weeks. He said more than 2,400 US service personnel had been killed in 2 decades. Well, as the last American troops withdrew from Kabul, a Taliban spokesman said Afghanistan had gained complete independence. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, is in Kabul.
I was reporting from Kabul in 1989 when the Soviet troops left, in 92 when the Mujahideen took power, in 2001 when a US-led invasion toppled the Taliban. Afghans have never lived through such a transition, which is so fraught with fear, which is so shrouded in darkness and uncertainty. The mantra of the United States during this withdrawal, which began months ago, was that it would be a safe, orderly and responsible withdrawal. And yet it is one which has ended not just in chaos and violence, but in pain and hurt for Afghans yet again. Afghans who had dared to hope that after the world came knocking on their door in 2001, that when they left it would be the best of days, except it is, for so many Afghans, the worst of days. The last US soldier has left, promising to come back and get those that they have left behind. And they are counted in. We can't count how many. All we see and hear are the pleading messages for help. But tomorrow morning, nearly 38 million Afghans will wake up and they will wonder, what will life be like under Taliban rule? There will be rules, there will be regulations, but will they be the kind of order that allows Afghans to think this is a country they can still call their own?
The BBC's chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, there, who has been reporting from Afghanistan for several years. Well, in the last hour, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, gave a statement on the situation in Afghanistan. He said the US evacuation from Kabul had been a massive undertaking, and he paid tribute to the personnel involved.
18 days ago, the United States and our allies began our evacuation and relocation operation in Kabul. As you just heard from the Pentagon, a few hours ago, that operation was completed. More than 123,000 people have been safely flown out of Afghanistan. That includes about 6,000 American citizens. This has been a massive military, diplomatic, and humanitarian undertaking, one of the most difficult in our nation's history, and an extraordinary feat of logistics and coordination under some of the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Many, many people made this possible. I want to commend our outstanding diplomats who worked around the clock and around the world to coordinate the operation, helping Americans our foreign partners who've been by our side for 20 years, and Afghans at risk at this critical moment was more than just a high-stakes assignment for our team. It was a sacred duty. And the world saw how our diplomats rose to the challenge with determination and heart.
Well, let's get more from our North America correspondent, Peter Bowes, on what Antony Blinken just said. Great to have you on the program, Peter. You know, apart from sort of thanking all of the people who helped in the effort to get Americans and Afghans out, Antony Blinken also talked about a new diplomatic chapter that has begun for the U.S., between the U.S. and Afghanistan. What does that mean in reality?
Well, in reality, I think it's going to be a very difficult diplomatic relationship because, as he put it, this is going to be a relationship not based on trust or faith. It will be based on the actions of the Taliban, not what they say they are going to do, but what they actually do. And that observation period is starting right now. Now that the Americans have left, what will the Taliban do? How will they treat the people in their country? Will they allow the free movement of people, especially those Afghans and indeed remaining Americans and other foreign nationals? Will they allow those people to leave the country if they want to, as they have promised? And then the bigger issues, anti-terrorism. There's, of course, a huge amount of concern internationally as to whether Afghanistan will once again become a breeding ground for terrorist groups. There are a whole swathe of issues that the Americans and other countries will be watching the Taliban very closely on to see what they actually do. And only then, I think, will the international community be able to really build on a diplomatic relationship if the Taliban do as they say they're going to do.
Yeah, a difficult situation for Antony Blinken, the U.S., of course, Peter, given the fact that he did talk about the fact that some 200 to 100 Americans are still in Afghanistan and they're still trying to get them out.
Yeah, and this was a presentation. It wasn't really a news conference by the Secretary of State. He didn't take any questions at the end, and he's getting a lot of criticism for that, especially in social media. And it's that point that you make that people are raising, that this essentially was a statement in which he acknowledged that maybe he said 200, then kind of revised it to closer to 100 Americans remaining in Afghanistan, announcing that and then not taking any questions about it and seemingly refusing to discuss it any further. And of course, this is a criticism that's been thrown at the Biden administration for several weeks now, as the events in Kabul and wider afield in Afghanistan have unfolded, that the Biden administration hasn't necessarily been as forthcoming as with information that some people would have liked. And there's still that huge question mark over the 100 to 200 Americans remaining in Afghanistan. He did indicate that he thought that some of those Americans may in fact want to stay. They might have very close roots in the country, close relations with Afghans in society, and actually want to stay in the country. But it's very clear that some just weren't able to get to the airport and weren't able to leave.
And very briefly, Peter, President Biden due to speak in the next day about the situation in Afghanistan. What are people expecting him to say?
Well, I think people are expecting him to address this very point of why it was always open to question why the US didn't extend the deadline beyond today, perhaps with the view of making it slightly easier to get all of those Americans out of the country that wanted to leave. So I think that could be central to what the president is going to say, perhaps providing more detail on his thinking.
Peter Bowes there, our North America correspondent. Thank you for joining us on Newsday. Meanwhile, in the last 24 hours, 5 rockets were fired at Kabul's international airport. 4 landed without incident. The 5th was neutralized by an American anti-missile system. The Pentagon says it also targeted an ISIS vehicle that was heading towards Kabul airport. But reports suggest the drone strike also killed 10 civilians, including several small children. The dead were all from a single extended family and were getting out of a car in their driveway when the strike hit the nearby ISIS vehicle. Sekunder Kermani has this report from Kabul.
Flames leaped from a car after militants from the Islamic State group used it to launch rockets at Kabul airport. They were intercepted by a missile defense system. But planes landing today fired flares to try and protect themselves from further attack. Nearby, a family combs through the wreckage of a US drone strike launched yesterday. Relatives and neighbours are collecting remains of the victims to bury. They angrily reject American claims the vehicle targeted was being used by a suicide bomber from the Islamic State group. If there was a bomb inside, the car would have been blown up, says this man. Amongst those killed, 2-year-old Sameya, 12-year-old Farzad, and these two twins, as well as Nasser, who had previously worked alongside American forces. The family was hoping to be evacuated out of the country.
My brother came from his work, want to park the car in here, and their children. It was in the car. On that time that happening, Okra.
And how many people from your family
10
died?
persons died in here. We lost 10 persons, including of my daughter. He was at 2 years old.
What happened here appears to be an awful human tragedy. It also underlines the challenges the US is going to face in trying to target militants from afar and the terrible consequences ordinary Afghans have to pay. The US has said it's assessing and investigating reports of civilian casualties, but insists an imminent threat to the airport was disrupted.
Nobody wants to see innocent life taken. We take it very, very seriously. And when we know that we have caused innocent life to be lost in the conduct of our operations, we're transparent about it. We're investigating this. I'm not going to get ahead of it.
The evacuation effort is now in its very final stages, with US soldiers being flown out ahead of Tuesday's withdrawal deadline. Many Afghans remain desperate to leave the country. At this bus stand in Kabul, many are headed for the Iranian border. Nearly all are hoping to be smuggled across. Passenger numbers have more than doubled in recent weeks. The previous government only cared about getting rich themselves, says this man. Now the Taliban are here. There are no jobs. There's no work anywhere. I need to be able to feed my kids. Everything has become more expensive. We can't live here anymore. A new era in Afghanistan is about to begin. The Taliban say they're bringing peace and ending corruption. But for those here, the deep uncertainty that has accompanied their arrival is a final push towards a new life. Sikandar Kamani, BBC News, Kabul.
Well, in other headlines today, there's a warning of life-threatening flooding in the southern United States as Hurricane Ida moves from Louisiana into Mississippi. The storm brought winds of 240 kilometers an hour as it made landfall on Sunday, ripping roofs off buildings. One man was killed when a falling tree hit his house. Flash floods have already affected residents of New Orleans, despite defenses being strengthened after Hurricane Katrina 16 years ago. Well, our correspondent Neda Tawfik reports from there.
This was the force of Ida's winds as it mercilessly pounded Louisiana with water. A hospital building filled with patients in the town of Cutoff was no match for the storm's fury. Part of the roof was lifted off with ease by the gusts. Low-lying areas were overwhelmed by the tidal surge. This footage from a fire station in Delacroix, Louisiana, captured the dramatic rush of water as the night wore on. In New Orleans, the entire city went dark as the storm raged outside and a transmission tower toppled into the Mississippi River. At this hotel, workers struggled to get their generator running. All across southern Louisiana, the painful task of surveying the damage from Hurricane Ida is underway. The destruction is immense, and the situation for some is desperate. In Jefferson Parish, emergency services have received at least 200 rescue calls since last night. There, the rising waters and intense winds left communities in tatters. Clarence has lived here for 50 years and says this is the worst storm he's lived through.
It's terrifying. I mean, we in the bedroom and it started leaking, and then we come out the bedroom and go into another room and start leaking in that room. And then finally we came into the living room and the dining room here. And this was the only room where it didn't really leak. It leaked, but it didn't leak that bad where the sheetrock fell in.
Without proper shelter, power, or water, he has no choice but to leave. His dilemma now, where to go.
Hurricane Ida strengthened so rapidly that it gave people here very little time to prepare or evacuate. For those who stayed, the night was scary, but seeing the fallout the morning after has been even harder.
Along the roadways, closed and impassable in many areas, we found this family walking to find food. The storm's strong winds ripped their trailer apart in the middle of the night. They took shelter at a neighbor's house.
I ain't got nothing left. House is gone, car is gone. Sorry.
Crews are now focused on rescue operations. The next step, recovery, will be long and difficult. Neda Tawfiq, BBC News, New Orleans.
Such a challenging time for all those families going through that. And if you want to get in touch with me on any of the stories that you've seen on Newsday, the floods, for instance, the hurricane that the devastation has caused there because of the hurricane, I'm on Twitter at BBC Karishma. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. Still to come on the programme, why it could be game over as China restricts the amount of time under 18s can spend in cyberspace.
She received the Nobel Peace Prize for her work with the poor and the dying in India's slums. The head of the Catholic Church said Mother Teresa was a wonderful example of how to help people in need.
We have to identify the bodies, then arrange the coffins and take them back home. Parents are waiting and wives are waiting. So.
Hostages appeared, some carried, some running, trying to escape the nightmare behind them.
Britain lost a princess today, described by all to whom she reached out as irreplaceable. An early morning car crash in a Paris underpass ended a life with more than its share of pain and courage, warmth and compassion.
This is Newsday on the BBC. I'm Karishma Vaswani in Singapore. Our main story. The Taliban have been celebrating with gunfire and fireworks after the last US military flight left Kabul, and America confirmed its 20-year war in Afghanistan was over. Well, let's stay with that top story. We can bring you the fact that the US military, as we've been telling you, has completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan after a mission lasting nearly 20 years. But what will the new era under the Taliban look like? Well, I'm joined now by Thomas Johnson, Professor of the National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School in California. His recent book is called Taliban Narratives, The Uses and Power of Stories in the Afghanistan Conflict. Great to have you on the programme. I want to just start by asking you, what do you think the Taliban's biggest challenge is now?
Well, I think the biggest challenge relates to a number of different things. People's fear, the stability of the country. ISIS-K will continue to try to disrupt and cause chaos like a terrorist organization usually does. I think they're going to have an extremely difficult time in governing because they don't have the financial resources. And, they're going to also, I think another way to look at this real briefly is to give you a little bit of an idea how they governed when they were in power from 1996 to 2001. There, they basically didn't govern at all other than institute radical Sharia law, which they'll again do this time. But they were terrible administrators. I mean, they had a council of 6 that controlled Kabul, right, and none of them could speak Dari. And I could give you other examples too, but I don't think I have the time.
Yeah, Thomas, just to jump in there, Antony Blinken saying that the U.S. will work with the Taliban if indeed the Taliban sticks to its commitments. What form of a relationship do you see happening there?
Well, I don't know. They've never stuck to any of their commitments. The historic peace agreement of February 29, 2020 wasn't even a peace agreement. It was a plan for a phased withdrawal. It had 4 other things in it that they haven't lived up to at all. So, I don't trust the sincerity of the Taliban or their word.
How much dissent do you think will be allowed?
Oh, I think they'll put dissent down, very quickly. Just like when they were in power, if people weren't following their view of radical Deobandi Shia, for example, if a woman in a burqa had her ankles showing, she'd be whipped with a car antenna. And if a man's beard wasn't 4 inches long, he would also be whipped. So I'm not sure they're going to be that radical, but they might. And the other thing to recognize is you've got to understand that there's, okay.
Yeah, Thomas, I just want to understand whether they will be able to gain support within the country.
Over the short term, I'm not so sure. People generally from 96 to 2001 lived in fear. Their view of Sharia law left women basically in their households, and they controlled the men also very, very carefully. So over the short term, I don't think they're going to have a lot of popular support. But if they can govern and administer, they might get support. Let me just say one more thing. I mean, over the last 4 or 5 years, in the districts that they controlled, they set up shadow governments. And shadow governors. So that they have a little more practice than they did surely when they reigned in 96 to 2001.
Thomas Johnson, Professor of the National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. Thank you for joining us on Newsday with all of your analysis. Well, let's take a look at some of the other stories in the headlines today. The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has had talks in the occupied West Bank with Israel's Defense Minister Benny Gantz. Mr. Gantz's office said he told the president that Israel would take measures to strengthen the Palestinian economy. Analysts say U.S. pressure is likely to have helped bring this about. Heavy rain has led to the flooding of 4 rivers in southwest China's Chongqing region. The rainfall also triggered widespread landslides. More than 2,000 people have been evacuated. Heavy rain is expected to continue until Tuesday. The European Union is recommending that its member countries reintroduce travel restrictions on unvaccinated travellers coming from the United States. That would mean quarantines or testing for those who have not received the jab. However, these are recommendations and they are not mandatory. Each EU member state imposes its own COVID guidelines and restrictions. Regulators in China have imposed restrictions on online video gaming, stopping anyone under 18 from playing more than 3 hours a week. They've been told they'll only be allowed to access the games between 8 and 9 in the evening on Fridays, Saturdays and Sundays, as well as on public holidays. Beijing says it wants to protect the physical and mental health of young people. Well, the BBC's China correspondent Stephen McDonnell is in Beijing and has more for us.
If you have so-called real name registration using actual IDs, which people are required to have in China, it is possible to force teenagers and children here to limit themselves to only 3 hours a week. A big question, though, remains as to whether or not games based overseas can be controlled in this way. Possibly not, but the announcement has just come out, so we're still trying to work out the precise nature of how this is to be policed. I mean, one way is for companies to actually use face scanning to make sure not only have you got your ID, which you can use, your real name identification, but also your face required in order for you to log on. So teenagers across China, well, there might be plenty of them who are pretty unhappy tonight, but at least some of their parents will be cheering about the fact that not only are they to be limited to 3 hours gaming, but specifically, only specifically 3 certain hours, Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights, 8 till 9 p.m, and that's it. You know, quite an amazing announcement in a way. It's sort of come out of the blue here. I know that a lot of people have spoken about the problems of gaming addiction here, just like in many other countries. But to have this very strict new set of rules put in place is quite something.
Tough to be a kid in China these days. That's all that we have time for on Newsday. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Karishma Vaswani. Do stay with BBC News.